Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Rafi Haywood, one of the assistant directors of the Global Systems Institute, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Gloria Crabolu, who is a lecturer in sustainable tourism on the Cornwall campus. And Gloria is basically just about to start a fellowship at the Cabinet Office with the government to work on like net zero evaluation. And I'm guessing that you're going to be using causal loop diagrams for that. And I look forward to hearing all about what they are and how they work. So thanks, Gloria, for coming. And yeah, please take it away.
Thank you, Rafi, for the introduction and for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure for me to speak about my research. So yeah, I'll be using more systems mapping, and during the fellowship, I don't think I'll be using causal loop diagrams. Maybe I will, but let's see once I start. But today I'm going to be speaking about how I use causal loop diagrams to evaluate the impact of a change intervention in the tourism sector. So if I have to, it's not, yeah, here it is. So if I have to structure this presentation, I will speak initially giving an introduction of causal loop diagrams, because I know some of you are completely new to causal loop diagrams. So I'm going to be giving you an introduction on this and speaking about why they are important in analyzing complex interventions. And then I'm going to be speaking about how I've used causal loop diagrams in this specific case of sustainability indicator schemes in tourism. And I'm going to be taking you through how I've used this method throughout the process, so that if you're thinking to using it in your own research, hopefully you're going to have a better understanding of how it works. So CLD, causal loop diagram, is a type of systems mapping tool, and there are various ones. So causal loop diagrams is just one of them. And through systems mapping, you're basically able to create a model, a visualization of a system or of a specific aspect of it. So there are various ways of doing that. You have also something called systems or participatory systems mapping, where you actually capture in a map a whole various policies, various factors, but also all the outcomes that you want to achieve from a policy perspective. And more and more is being used in transitions research as well, on something called backcasting. So to capture the systems when it comes to trying to achieve a specific goal and trying to identify actions and factors affecting the achievement of a specific goal that you want to achieve, for example, by 2030 or by 2050 and so on. It's important to say that they are models, so they are not a real representation of reality. And this is very important because sometimes you receive some criticisms about this map because they don't try to capture the whole system. So it's a multi-subjective perspective of how a system really works. Oh, something important here is I've included this reference of this book. So if you want to learn more on systems mapping, I really encourage you to download this book by Peter Barbrook Johnson and Alex Penn. It's open access, and they speak a lot about how these systems mapping tools can be used in various contexts. So what is a CLD in this case? A CLD looks at incorporating or capturing a behavior of a system, and it focuses a lot on feedback loops. So in here, you want to capture a lot how a lot of factors behave within a system. So it includes, as I said, feedback loops that can be reinforcing or balancing. And here on the top right side, I've included some examples of the tourism industry. So as you can see, a reinforcing feedback loop here, it includes some factors and some relationships that are positive. And in this case, you have, for example, the number of international, sorry, I'm losing my voice. So you have the number of international tourist arrivals. If that number increases, then the employment rate will increase as a consequence of that. And then the disposable income will also increase. As a consequence, it will create a reinforcing loop. From a balancing perspective, you have the tourist arrivals. So this is more from a local perspective. The more number of tourists you have, the more the more crowdedness you're gonna have in the place. And because of this, the destination attractiveness will decrease. So less attractiveness in the destination, less tourist arrivals. And this creates some kind of negative or balancing feedback loop. So how can we use this in policy evaluations? In this case, we have to see an intervention as part of the system. And what happens once you include that intervention within a system? So what are all the different mechanisms that it triggers, and how are those mechanisms affecting positively and negatively the outcomes that we want to achieve? So if we want to achieve sustainability improvement, how is that intervention contributing through various different factors, either positively or negatively, to the achievement of the outcome that we want to achieve? And this is when I'm gonna speak about sustainability indicator schemes in tourism. I would say that sustainability indicator schemes are widely used also in other sectors, but in tourism, they have been used specifically since the 90s, when an organization, the World Tourism Organization, has included or has developed this massive handbook on monitoring sustainability in tourism. And because of this, after the release of this handbook, a lot of researchers and destinations have started designing new indicator schemes. So something complex about the tourism industry in specific is that once you decide to implement these schemes, you have to engage various different stakeholders together, both from the private sector, such as hotels, tour operators, but also from the public sector. So if you're speaking about national level, you would be speaking about DEFRA. But if you're implementing these indicators from a destination perspective, of course, we're speaking about various departments within a council. And that's the most difficult part, is really creating that buy-in among stakeholders that are not really directly involved in tourism. And research in this area has focused mainly on designing and collecting new indicators. So it's all about how can we design more cost-effective indicators instead of, or I would say that a lot of neglect has been given to whether these indicators are fit for purpose, whether they're actually creating the change that, that we want them to create. So this is just an example of some of the sustainability indicator schemes that exist across Europe. There are quite a lot, and some of them exist at national level, some at city level, some are private, some are publicly funded, and some are have been sponsored at European by the European Commission. So yes, some of them have, for example, 10 indicators, some have 60 to 100. So as you can see, there is a lot of variety on them. And this is why it's very interesting from an evaluation point of view to understand how this variety creates different mechanisms in creating change. So in a way, sustainability indicator schemes are a change intervention. They're basically a tool that we can use to improve the sustainability of a destination. Yeah, it's an instrument that can help us to achieve, to take us where we want to be. And from an evaluation point of view, we might decide that these tools are actually not working. They're not actually not helping us to achieve what we want to achieve. And this is when, from, again, an evaluation point of view, we might decide that we should invest in different instruments to improve sustainability. Especially because when we look at research outside of the tourism literature, it tells us that sustainability indicators are rarely used in the policy making. So from this research, we might, and I want to emphasize might, conclude that indicators are not really fit for purpose. We're investing loads of research, loads of, in a way, taxpayer money in designing new and innovative indicators that are actually not bringing the change that we want to bring. But again, this is more from the research that has already been done. And this is why it's important to conduct evaluations from a systems perspective. So how do we think that they work as a change intervention? This is what we've been taught usually, and this is how, when you look at manuals of sustainability indicator schemes, you usually have this very linear step-by-step process of collecting data, of identifying problems. Once you collect the data, then identifying solutions and designing policies based on these solutions to change the current situation. And based on that, I'm going to have sustainability performance improvement. So as you can see, it's very linear, and it's informed by a concept called evidence-based policy. And if you're familiar with policy literature, you would know that evidence-based policy is quite hard to achieve because the policy-making process is very complex as a concept, and is influenced by various different factors. And data is just one of the many factors that influence the policy-making process. So, and this is what we've done initially when we did the evaluation. This was at the very, very beginning. And at that time, I didn't really have the knowledge that I have now on systems thinking. And this is, so having that little knowledge I conducted the evaluation following this linear, the one from this slide, this linear type of evaluation. And we took one example, which is the European Tourism Indicator System. So it's a system that has been designed by the European Commission. It includes 67 sustainability indicators, and it's a voluntary type of system. That means that anyone can download the toolkit. It includes the how to do step, all the different questionnaires, all the different invitation letters, and so on and so on. And it's been implemented by various different destinations across Europe. So here are some of them. At the bottom here, you can have access to the papers that we've published based on this evaluation. And again, I want to iterate that this evaluation was conducted more from that linear type of thinking. And we use something called absorptive capacity, which is a concept that is widely known in business, and is used to understand how companies acquire and assimilate information to make sense of it and to take a competitive advantage. So in this case, we wanted to know how destinations acquire data, they assimilate it, they transform it, and they explore it. So it's very similar to the step-by-step process that I've shown you just initially. And this is the results that we've got. So as you can see, it's just 8% of the destinations that had managed to use the data in the policymaking process and to actually have some sustainability improvement out of it. So you might say that this iterates the point that was made by other research that sustainability indicator schemes are rarely used in the policymaking process. But after having this understanding, I was actually able to ask a different questions. So what are the mechanisms that are creating this positive impact in these 8% of destinations? And what are the negative mechanisms that are actually preventing all the other destinations to achieve the outcome that they want to achieve, be it the use of data in the policymaking process, and be it the sustainability improvement. So from here, then, from the linear perspective, I moved to a systems perspective where sustainable tourism indicator schemes are then seen as an intervention within the system. So the system in this case is the destination. And I'm trying to capture all the various factors that are interacting with each other, and they're creating some kind of behavior within a system that would tell me how they're contributing either positively or negatively to the achievement of the sustainability improvement. And this is what I've done. So initially, yeah, of course, you have to listen to a diverse pool of stakeholders. You bring various people together and you start mapping the system. And then something that I would say a lot of academics forget is to identify the leverage points. So once you have the system map in place, it's very important to make use of that map by identifying those factors that can be triggered, can be either amplified or even frozen, because they have a ripple effect within the whole system. And from doing that, I can actually create a positive change. So if I can capture the negative mechanisms that are preventing these indicators to create a positive effect, then I can use the strength or the power of leverage points to move those negative mechanisms into positive ones. And something important to say about causal loop diagrams is that you can either develop them through a participatory approach. So you bring stakeholders together in the room and you develop the map together with the stakeholders, or through a traditional textual approach. So you have interviews, you have focus groups, and based on that, you gather text that is then analyzed to capture all the factors and develop the causal loop diagram. Okay, so this is what I've done. That's because it was through the PhD, and of course I had the time to develop two phases of research. So this is what you should be ideally doing. First, you should be analyzing a specific case study, so a place-based context, where you understand from a single destination what are the different mechanisms. And then from a holistic perspective, you understand what is happening across different destinations. And in my case, I used the traditional textual data. So I had interviews, focus groups, and documents. I would say that there are pros and cons with both approaches, because with participatory approaches, of course, you have more buy-in in the map, in the development of the map. because the stakeholders have actually created the map themselves and they understand it better. And on the other side, with the textual data, it's really hard to communicate the systems map to stakeholders. But then this approach is really helpful whenever you're not able to bring stakeholders in the same room. And this was the case for my research, where especially in the case study, stakeholders have fallen apart. So they didn't want to meet each other in the same room. And for this reason, by having interviews, you're actually able to hear all the different voices that are part of the system. So there are various steps in developing the CLD. I've spoken about I would say the first two steps. That is about the identification of the situation of interest. So in this case, it's about identifying the borders of your system. In this case, it's of course the destination, and it's about the implementation of sustainability indicator schemes. And the time horizon, that in my case was pretty easy because it was from the moment in which the destination decided to implement these schemes up to now, to when you decide to be. So in my case, it was up to when I was collecting the data. Then, of course, you start collecting the textual data, and then you start constructing the CLD. And after the CLD, you have the identification of the leverage points. So, of course, this is the process that you have to follow whenever you develop textual-based CLDs. For participatory approaches, the process would be different. But for textual-based, you have to follow these 4 steps. So the first 2, they come from a traditional thematic coding, where when you have the main codes, the main themes of the textual data and the sub-themes. And then the other 2 steps are the system mapping coding of causality coding, where you're actually extrapolating the factors from the sub-themes and creating the relationships. And then you have the causal mapping. So you combine all the different coding tree that you have developed into a feedback loop, and then you have the whole causal loop diagram. So what you're gonna have at the end is something called a relationship codebook, which I just want to show you here. This is how it looks like. You have the theme, the sub-theme, and then you have the causality coding and the name of the feedback loop that you have created. So in the causality coding, you have basically a list of linear relationships with all the polarities, which can be, as I said, positive or negative. So when it's positive, it means that when factor A increases, then factor B increases as well. Or if factor A decreases, then factor B decreases as well. But if the polarity is negative, it means the opposite. So if factor A increases, then factor B decreases. So once you have the relationship codebook, then you are able to develop the whole causal loop diagram, which is here. So of course, here you have 2 causal loop diagrams, one that was developed for the single destination and the other one that was developed at European level. What I would say, and it's something very important, is that the process is never so linear. It doesn't start from step 1 and then step 2, step 3, and so on. It's very iterative. So it means that you first have a map that is super messy. You have a lot of connections everywhere. And then there is the crafting process of combining different factors together, combining different relationships as well to make it understandable for everyone. So in a way, you have to find a balance between having the whole complexity of the system, capturing all of the complexity, but then you have something that nobody will understand. Or trying to minimize the complexity in something that is easy to use and easy to understand for everyone. So there has to be that really nice balance between the two things, which sometimes is quite hard to get. I wonder if there is any questions so far, or should I continue? Maybe questions in the chat.
I actually have a question about these diagrams, and I was just wondering if the because I mean, you're just showing two, and I've not seen others, not that I can think of, but they have pretty different shapes, and that second one, it has that little bubble on the side, and I just wondered if, I mean, they'll of course have lots of different shapes, right? And does the overall shape tell you something about the system?
Yeah, I would say that it can have the shape that you really want. Is sometimes when it comes about when you look about some CLDs, they're very not simple, but not as complex as these ones, I would say. So you have maybe maximum 20 factors and connections. So based on that, you're gonna have a different shape. But I would say that the shape in itself, it doesn't matter. Like the crafting part is about trying to avoid relationships crossing with one another, so arrows crossing with one another, and this is how the shape might be different. So if you try maybe making it as small as possible or as big as possible, you can try to move certain relationships in a different area.
Okay, thank you. So there's nothing peculiar about that little blob that's on the right-hand side of that.
So in the right-hand side, it kind of came natural actually, but in the right-hand side, I wanted to see, as I mentioned, the various the impact of these tools, and I divided the type of impact in 3 different areas. So it reads here the conceptual role, the instrumental role, and the structural role. Whenever I was developing the map, I didn't have these roles in my mind. It just came about only after the whole map was developed. And then I was able to group them into macro categories to again make sense of the data, because sometimes when you present to the whole map to a whole group of people, it might be quite overwhelming, right? So the whole process of communication, it's about breaking down the map into smaller areas and then developing a narrative from these smaller areas. But yeah, whenever you start developing, there is no real shape that you want to have, as long as it's clear and it's readable.
Oh, thank you. There's another question. Would you like to speak up? Or there was a hand raised.
Yeah, that was me.
Oh yeah, okay.
I have a quick question. Is this one-dimensional?
One dimension. Sorry, what do you mean by one dimension?
Is supposed to come out in a 3D shape, or is this supposed to?
Okay, yeah, no. Maybe that would be the next step, but at the moment, no, it's not 3-dimensional or just 2D. But in this case, so since it was done in 2 different contexts, so one was a single destination and the other one various different destinations coming into various focus groups, I would say that some of these loops are pretty similar to one another, but then there are some mechanisms that were peculiar to one single destination. The same is true for the other causal loop diagram, the one on the right-hand side. There were certain things that didn't come up in the first CLD development. Because in the case-based causal loop diagram, so the context was that everything went very well, very successful for the first 2 years. but then throughout the process, everyone fell apart. So I wanted to capture those mechanisms that, of course, are very specific to the context, and they don't come up to a macro scale context. But then in the macro scale context, there were destinations that were very successful in implementing these systems, these indicator schemes. And so those positive mechanisms didn't come up in the first one. So that's why it's important that if you're doing research of this kind and you're able to do the two systems analysis, you're gonna have different data and different narratives that in the end will help you to come up with leverage points.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think one last question from my side. I have no prior knowledge of coding. How much mastery in coding is required to actually do one of these?
Yeah, it's but I didn't have any knowledge in CLD coding, so I had knowledge in the typical qualitative textual data analysis. So that was very easy for me. But then the process of identifying the factors and the relationships, that can be very daunting sometimes, and that's why iteration is very important. And I think if you can have a mentor who is expert in systems thinking and causal loop diagrams, that's a plus. Otherwise, it's all about doing iterations until when you're satisfied with the map. And it doesn't have to be perfect. So as I said before, these are mental models. So they don't represent the real system of the world or the system that you are analyzing. And that's fine. That as long as they are useful for the purpose that you want to use them for, this is what counts the most.
Thank you ever so much. I think there are questions in the chat.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'll be happy to read those out. So we have a question from Matthew, who says, while you have positive and negative feedbacks, can you have different weightings to different feedbacks so that some are more significant than others? And how would you identify that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, you have, if you want to add another layer, yes, you should have also the power or the influence of the relationship. I haven't used that in my study, also because of the lack of the participatory approach. So if you are in a room with various people, then you have the second layer of the map analysis, where you actually identify what are the most powerful relationships between factors. And it's actually easy to show them in the map. Usually you have, you can use the thickness of the arrows. There are few examples existing where they've done so. And for example, they provide 3 variables, like very influential, influential or little influential. And then you have 3 different sizes of the arrows.
Wonderful. And I think we have one last question before we move on from Kate. Oh, 2 questions. We'll just do, I think this is still a bit more presentation to go. Is that right, Gloria? So I think we'll do these last 2 questions in the chat, and then we'll take some more questions at the end. One question from Kate is a Kumu, forgive my ignorance if I pronounce that wrong, map useful for some of these relationships?
Yeah, I've actually used Kumu for building the map initially, so that was really, really helpful. And it's quite, an easy to use tool. At least I find it quite easy, because there is you find a lot of how to guidelines on how to use it on Kumu. So these 2 maps here have been developed on Kumu.
Great. And one last question for now from Jenny. How much agreement is there on sustainability, in quotes, I guess?
Yes, so that's interesting because it relates also to the use of sustainability indicators for this case study, where yeah, when it comes to having a decision on what type of indicators to choose, then there is disagreements about across various different stakeholders on what sustainability is and what are the indicators that are more important at the destination, or it can be in any other context in your case. And so in that case, it's like, yeah, it can be part of the discussion. And I think I'm gonna speak a little bit more in one of the coming slides. Maybe we'll answer your questions better.
Perfect. We'll do some more questions at the end. Thank you, Gloria.
Okay, so let's move to the leverage points. This is actually I would say the most exciting part, because this is when you ask yourself the question, and so what? So I have this systems map, but what do I do with it? And how can it help me make better decisions or come up with recommendations for the stakeholders that I've been engaging? So leverage points, as I said before, are factors that can be amplified or frozen or can be taken into consideration as they have a big impact on the whole map. So these are factors that can have a lot of influence, so a lot of arrows inwards and outwards. And that means that they have a ripple effect across the whole system. It can be also hidden factors. So usually maybe they have just one connection, but they're very influential that can have a very important impact if triggered, if amplified throughout the whole system. And something important to say is that you have to focus on the factors that can be controlled, that are under your control, or that can be easily influenced by the stakeholders that you're working with. Otherwise, these are not points, leverage points. You can't make any change within these factors. So this table gives you an overview of all the different types of leverage points that you can look at and what you need to do once you identify one of those. So once you identify the leverage points, which are, again, a list of factors that you want to either amplify or try to eradicate, then you design enabling conditions, which are like enabling conditions are basically things to do that stakeholders can easily understand and take into consideration when it comes to, in my case, improving or maximizing the impact of the change intervention. So in this case, is a list of recommendations that stakeholders can do when it comes to both designing indicator schemes, but also implementing them. So this is a list of 8 enabling conditions, and each of them relates to one or more factors within the system. So I'm not gonna go through all of them. I'm just gonna show some of them to you, so that you at least can see the process of how I've identified them and how I've developed the enabling condition. So the first one comes from the first map and is about the sense of urgency for action. And this is one of those examples that doesn't have a lot of connections. In fact, it's just one inward and one outward, but it has a big impact throughout the whole system. And this was just visible in the case-based context. So just to give you a little bit of background, this is a destination that relied and still relies a lot upon tourism. And we are speaking about a timeline, I think it was in 2008 or 2010, when there was a massive, the world economic financial crisis. And because of that, they were suffering from under tourism. yeah, here there is a better version, a zoomed in version of that section of the map. So because it was under tourism, it created some kind of sense of urgency among stakeholders. So stakeholders came together because of this to try to do something around the tourism industry to make them more resilient. So they started dialogue amongst them, and one of the collective actions that they took was to implement sustainability indicator schemes. Whereas what you see in the other destinations is that usually you have funding available because of a partnership between a university and various different destinations or the designers of the indicator schemes. So because of the funding, then you start implementing indicators in a destination. And that means that stakeholders are not really interested in implementing them. And they start meeting together only after indicators have started to be implemented. So because of this, if there is no initial interest, it means that it's very difficult for that buy-in, for that initial motivations to last for a long time. So by implementing sustainability indicators where the energy lies, I mean, mainly when it comes to developing sustainability schemes at national level, where you need to focus on destinations that are where stakeholders are already acting together on sustainability issues. Because by doing that, and there is another section in the map that shows it, you start creating a critical mass, so some kind of tipping point where a lot of other destinations start being involved and interested in these schemes. So then we have another example that is about designing STI, means Sustainable Tourism Indicators schemes, based on the contextual needs of the destination. And the leverage point here is the discrepancy between scheme and locally relevant indicators. So let's say that this scheme has something like 60 to 100 indicators, so a long list of indicators that provides you a perfect blueprint of sustainability. Whereas the number of indicators that are actually relevant to the destination, and here I reply to the question that was made whether sustainability was an agreed concept, are actually much lower. So if there is this big discrepancy, then the relevance of the scheme start decreasing. And because of this, there is very little uptake of the data from the indicators in the policymaking process. But it also creates a feeling of frustration amongst the stakeholders involved in the collection of data. Because you have to understand that these stakeholders are not employed to collect sustainability data. They are like working in tourism and they usually have other responsibilities. So if you burden them with a list of 60 or 100 indicators, and most of them are not even relevant to them, it creates this feeling of frustrations that lead to very little interest towards the scheme. And as an end result, stakeholders stop using them. Okay, so by instead focusing on something that is on a scheme, on a list of indicators that is small and simple, and this relates to the other enabling condition, you're able to create a higher relevance of the scheme, reduce the complexity, and therefore reduce the feelings of frustration. And this was done throughout various different destinations where they started maybe with 2 indicators first. They built the knowledge amongst different stakeholders, and little by little over the years, they started introducing more and more, therefore changing the mental models about sustainability. So there was more agreement in that case on the concept of sustainability. Then the final one, it's learning. And as you can see here, is a type of leverage points that is connected, that has a lot of inward and outward connections. And so it's about building and maintaining a learning and dialogic infrastructure. So if you remember initially, I showed you a very linear step-by-step concept on how to implement indicators. That is just about collecting data, identifying the issue, making policy changes, and improving sustainability. But in fact, in a lot of destinations, they had a whole mechanism in process where stakeholders were engaged in learning. There were a lot of trainings behind, a lot of workshops, participatory workshops on design thinking, on how you can make sense of data, sustainability data through indicators, and so on. So this is why it's very important to strengthen this learning process that is going on when it comes to implementing indicators. So what I've learned from the process is that a systems lens can provide with a better understanding of the impacts of complex interventions, especially having done an intervention using linear thinking and comparing it to the one where I've used systems thinking. So yeah, the use of CLDs has helped generate new narratives that I didn't have before. And these narratives are very helpful for evaluators of these interventions, but also for those that are using these schemes. And this technique was able to provide insight, as I said, from the design perspective and also implementation perspective on how these interventions can become more impactful. So, of course, the big challenge is about communicating the map. This is one of the big criticisms on systems mapping. It's very difficult to communicate complex maps, but the conclusion that I have, at least from this initial use, is that sometimes you don't need to communicate the map in itself. It's about communicating the narratives that you extrapolate thanks to the development of the map. And that can be done through storytelling or just through the design of these enabling conditions. But I think in general, more research should be done on how we can make these tools more accessible, more practical to practitioners and evaluators in general. Okay, so thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gloria. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to pop them in the chat, or if you are able to raise your hand, since we're all here virtually, you're welcome to kind of raise your hand and then shout out your answer verbally as well. Your question even. I think I can't see any raised hands right now, so I think I'll read out the questions. Or Gloria, you're welcome to have a look at the group chat as well if you're able to access it.
Yes, I'm just looking at it now.
There's a new question from Matthew.
Yeah, so I think the earliest question is from, forgive me for any mispronunciation, Asela. Oh no, Asela, your question was answered, so that's fine. So I think just from Francesca and Matthew, I think, and Terry.
Feel free to shout out your questions.
Yes, so Stella, I can see that you've asked how to identify tipping points from CLDs. So I don't think there is a generic answer to that, but I can show you, maybe if I share again this screen, how the tipping point was identified. So let me go back. Okay. So, I mean, this is not very clear. I should have zoomed that in, but I don't know if you see. So let me just use the laser. So if you see here, there is a loop that is called critical mass development, and that's I would say, the tipping point. So there is not a number because this is a qualitative study, it's not a quantitative study. But what I identified was that after you start implementing these schemes in destinations that have the active energy, so the energy that I mentioned earlier on, where there is sense of urgency initially, then a lot of there is some kind of peer pressure activated. There is a momentum for positive change activated across all the various destinations that have not implemented these schemes yet. And because of that, you have more people, more stakeholders, or more destinations being involved. And from that, you start creating a critical mass of people. So that's kind of similar to the tipping point that you've mentioned. Then I'm not sure I can see the other questions.
That's all right. I'm happy to read out if that's quicker and easier for everyone. So another question from Matthew, who says the diagrams seem to represent stable systems where the factors may fluctuate but not fundamentally change. Is there a way with CLDs to identify limits to systems beyond which there would need to be a shift to a different system diagram?
So if I understand correctly, these factors, yeah, what you're saying is that these factors are not actually changing over time. So what I've identified here is like how the system behaved in that time frame that I've evaluated. So, and it's more about giving you giving you information on the mechanisms, on the behavior of the system. So for example, if you do something, if you have more of this factor, then you're gonna have more of the other factor. And that doesn't represent that happens in every single destination, but by doing that, you're able to capture, for example, if you're a destination, you can locate yourself in the system and identify, okay, in my system, I can see that all these factors are existing. And in this way, I know what I need to do in order to minimize the negative mechanisms in order to maximize the impact of the indicators. But I don't know if you want to explain better your question or...
I think that's all that's in there for the moment. If there's another response to that, I'll let you know. Next question. If mapping is done with stakeholders, how useful is it in helping them understand their system?
Yeah, I think this is, of course, if you do a participatory process, you're basically developing the map with stakeholders, and by doing that, stakeholders are more engaged in understanding systems thinking in general, but also understanding their system. So yeah, there is that pro of having participatory approaches. So if that's a tool that is available to you, I would say to go first with the participatory approaches. But in order for CLDs to be accessible, they can also be used without implementing them from a participatory point of view. But of course, engaging them would allow you to having them more engaged and, as you said, helping them understand their system.
Lovely. And I think this is the last question we have for now, is from Jenny, who says there is a lot of concern about policy being too down. Do you think systems thinking, as you have outlined, will help counter that so it becomes more acceptable to stakeholders?
Yes, so that is one of the challenges, right? Especially, I think the answer is yes, because, and it depends how systems mapping is done. If I look, for example, at my future work at the Cabinet Office, where we would be implementing another systems mapping tool, most likely, And ideally, you would be inviting not only policymakers, but stakeholders from the industry. And this is when you have, you're developing policies that come more from a bottom-up approach. Well, not bottom-up, it's more of a together approach, because it's more, it's from both sides, right? But yes, I agree with you that I think system thinking actually makes policy and policy making more acceptable to stakeholders and more accessible, I would say.
Oh. Are there any other questions? Anyone want to raise their hand or pop something in the chat? I'll give you a few seconds. You should be able to unmute yourselves if you want to. No, I think we're all good.
And if you're like engaging or in the process of starting a causal loop diagram, and you want to, pop me an email with questions, you're very welcome to do so. I know that the process can be very daunting, so I've been there, and having sometimes somebody to tell you, or maybe you should go about this way instead, can be very helpful.
Amazing. Great. Thank you so much, Gloria.
Thank you, Gloria.
And thank you so much to everyone who came to attend today. Recording will be shared on the university YouTube account as per. If you have any trouble finding that, ping us a message. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Gloria.
Thank you.